Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My dear brothers and sisters, I hope that you find this video in a state of taqwa and tawakkul during these calamitous times that our brothers and sisters all over the world, be it the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang or the Rohingya Muslims who are refugees in South Bangladesh, or our Palestinian brothers and sisters in Gaza and the West Bank, or the Muslims in India who are being oppressed by the BJP and Hindu nationalists, regardless of where you are. I remind to myself and to you that taqwa is the foremost component, foremost source of strength that we can have during troubles and difficulties that a Muslim faces in the dunya. Now, in the series of videos that we have been doing regarding Tawheed and Shirk, I started the discussion of Shirk, which is the biggest sin according to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And we talked about Shirk in Rububiyah, that is assigning equals to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's rights. And in Shirk in Rububiyah, the first component we looked at was shirk by association. So that is essentially associating partners to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is one of the most prominent ways people breach Tawheed since time immemorial. Today we will be talking about shirk by negation. So this category of shirk by negation, essentially means denying the existence of God. Thinking that there is no God, God doesn't exist. And it could be an outward expression or something internal. It could be a clear negation, very easy to understand if someone walks up to you and says, "No, I do not believe in God. I don't think that God exists." If God exists, then why doesn't God interfere? Why is there so much suffering? So on and so forth. So this is a very blunt form of atheism, thinking that there is no God. But it could also be a vague expression, something unclear, something difficult to understand. So I want to bring out a few examples of shirk by negation that exists in the world today and in the past, so that you can understand this better. Now, among the religions, if you look at different religions and philosophies, one of the foremost philosophies that have gained somewhat of a reputation and has spread in several countries is Buddhism. So Buddhism, it has two popular forms. There is a Buddhism called the Hinayana Buddhism, which is more popular in the Eastern Asian regions like Japan, and I think even Burma or Myanmar has a form of Hinayana Buddhism. And there is also the more perhaps compromised version of Buddhism, which is called Theravada Buddhism. Now, Buddhism is said to be found by a man called Gautama. And essentially, when you look at Buddhism very clearly, especially the Hinayana branch of Buddhism, very clearly indicates that there is no God, that they do not believe in God. And when you try to explore the realms of questions regarding creation, regarding the things that God has done according to Jewish, Christian and Muslim belief, This forms of Buddhism actually does not have clear-cut answers and kind of indicates that those domains are domains which are best unattended to. That we shouldn't be asking those questions about the beginning of creation and things like that. So, ultimately, the initial form of Buddhism, once Gautama passed away, they were subject to certain changes, and then Hinayana and Theravada Buddhism spread. Mostly in the southern Asian region, we find the Theravada Buddhism, like in countries like Sri Lanka and the East Asian region. There are traces of Hinayana Buddhism. And overall, it also assimilated into Hinduism. And Hinduism, of course, we know, is not a religion that denies the existence of God. They have the high power god, the Brahma. They have other powerful gods, Vishnu, Shiva, and other gods like Saraswati and Ganesh and Ganpat and all kinds of gods. So that is shirk by association in Hinduism. In Buddhism, we find shirk by negation. Similarly, right around the time that Buddhism spread, Buddhism actually, there is also a religion that got some kind of followers called Jainism. And Jainism is essentially systemized by Vardhamana, meaning that there is no God, but liberated souls that achieve something of divine status, having immortality and omniscience. So what happens is that the Jainism concept is that our souls, we can fast and meditate and put ourselves through certain excruciatingly perhaps difficult and unbearable torment, and at the far end of those efforts we will be liberated. Our souls will be liberated, attaining a status of immortality. There is no God. This is just, everything's just happening and we're just existing as souls. And when we think about Islam, Islam very clearly says, and this is known in Christianity and even Judaism, that the soul is a creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the soul goes back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. But Jainism takes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala out of the equation and says the soul, once you attain somewhat of a higher position, you get liberated. This is another form of clear negation of the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Another very old example, and something that is quite commonly occurs in the world, is the Pharaoh of the Prophet Musa alayhi salam's time. So Pharaoh is someone who deified himself. He said that I am God. فَقَالَ أَنَا رَبُّكُمُ الْأَعْلَى. The Quran very clearly says what Pharaoh mentioned. He said, I am your Lord, the Most High. Pharaoh said this, a man. So Pharaoh, all of you probably know, Pharaoh is the official title given to the king of Egypt. So during Musa alayhi salam's time, the Pharaoh that existed was an extremely egotistical man, and this man used to ask the people to worship him. So people used to prostrate to him, worship him, idolize him. So he was the king, he was the god. And we all know how Musa alayhi salam, with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's help, saved the children of Israel who was under oppression by this Pharaoh and ultimately left Egypt. So this case, if a man is claiming to be God, then that man has to deny the existence of true gods, or true God, astaghfirullah. And we know, if you look at the past century even, there are many people who have claimed divinity, who have said, I am God. We have seen occurrences of that in India, mostly in the Asian region, where people come and say, I am your God, worship me, and I can turn stone into gold, I can walk on water, I can turn wine into, or water into wine, and things like that. And by doing so, they deny the existence of true God. If that is a case that you perhaps witness, know that this is clear shirk by negation. It is the most extreme sin a man can do, and it is unforgivable, and whoever is making this claim and whoever is believing him and whoever is following him is doomed for eternity. May Allah save us from such evil. Now, as time went by, philosophical schools of thought started to emerge, mostly out of the European region. So we know that a very prominent form of philosophy is Greek philosophy. And then there were other philosophers all over the world. Europe is like a garden of different philosophical thought, and we see philosophies by different people coming into play that proposes the concept of shirk by negation. So one of the most prominent theories is the death of God philosophy, which was proposed by a German philosopher, Philip Mainlander, in the 18th or the 19th century. And in his book, The Philosophy of Redemption, in 1876, he states that the world begins with the death of God. So God died and then the world began. Because God is a principle of unity, and by the death, that principle of unity shattered to plurality. And that is what we see in the world. The world is a plural place. God is united, God is one. So God died, and therefore the world was born. This is what Philip Mainlander proposed. Now, right around that time, there was actually another philosopher, in my personal opinion, someone who actually proposed very wretched ideas and ideas that corrupted mankind, and it has influenced some men to even commit heinous crimes, even today. Of course, this philosopher I'm talking about is Friedrich Nietzsche. So Nietzsche was a main proponent of this concept of death of God, and he said that God is actually nothing more than a projection of man's conscience. So man imagines God because man is essentially someone who has an uneasy conscience. This Nietzsche said that our sense of aversion to do wrong, right? When we do something sinful, we feel a bit of a hesitancy, we feel a bit of a friction. We don't want to do something bad. That is that uneasy conscience that Nietzsche proposed. And because of that uneasiness, man imagined of God. That we projected that uneasiness that we have in our conscience to be God. And therefore God doesn't actually exist. God is dead. And man could actually be Superman. Not the Superman in comic books that you see, not the Clark Kent character. But Nietzsche actually proposed a concept of Superman, saying that man could achieve an ideal status, super strength, a super status by himself, and achieve unimaginable feats. I have read a little bit of an excerpt from Nietzsche's work, and actually I found it to be quite ridiculous. And when you observe, if you ever get to read Nietzsche's work, I would also advise you to read Nietzsche's life, what his life experiences were. And Nietzsche is not someone who had a good life. He had a lot of troubles. He was ill for most of his life. He was someone who had certain disabilities, and all of these things tormented him very much. So he had this vision of, being able to do more, being able to do better. And I feel that Nietzsche's work is actually a result of his wanting, his need to be something more than what he could be. And another French philosopher, Jean-Paul Sartre, he also echoed this concept of death of God. He said that God couldn't exist because God was a contradiction. He said that the idea of God, according to him, is a projection which man must make, being what he is. So it is again a variation of the idea that God is a figment of imagination of man, and God really doesn't exist. Subhanallah. This brings me to another very prominent example of the non-existence of God theory. Darwin, a foolish man in my personal opinion, to think that his grandfather was a monkey. Nonetheless, Darwin proposed this very widely adopted theory, and it has never been proven, and it has now kind of being erased out of existence as people understand how foolish it is. Regardless, right around the 19th century, Darwin proposed the theory of evolution. You would have seen that image printed all over the place, sometimes of a monkey and then another ape. So about 5 or 6 ape-like, monkey-like characters slowly, their backbone straightening ultimately to reach man. And during this process, you have the Neanderthal and all kinds of different variations. So it was a very elaborate theory to be fair by Darwin. So he said that the scientific approach proposes, or the scientific theory behind man's existence, is that man evolved from a monkey. Subhanallah. Another good example for contemporary propositions of the non-existence of God is, of course, Marxism and communists and socialists. We find socialists, we find them with Che Guevara, we find socialists, of course, the United States, or the USSR, my mistake, the Soviet Union, people like Joseph Stalin, Mussolini had these different ideas, different variations of communism and socialism and Marxism. All of these different concepts proposes the idea of non-existence of God, and it kind of motivates people to take their fate into their own hands. You deny God, you say that there is no God, your religion, you keep it at your home, you don't bring it outside. Don't mix religion with your life, right? Communism is very popular in China. We know Mao Zedong was a very successful leader in that respect. But actually all of these leaders' names that I mentioned who brought communism and Marxism and socialism, if you really look at it, they are people who have committed, if not genocide, they have committed mass murder. Thousands and thousands of people, hundreds and thousands of people killed. Mussolini, Stalin, Hitler, then you have Mao Zedong, even all these different leaders, even Che Guevara and his companion Fidel Castro. All their revolutions led to all-out war or ethnic conflict or civil conflict, and led to tens and thousands of people's death. Innocent people, innocent civilians. This is what happens when people come up with their own ideas and deny the existence of God. Now, in modern times, the most popular form of government is democracy. So democracy is essentially said to be a little bit of communism, a little bit of socialism, and then you bring in the concept of voting and debate into governance. So the parliament, whatever you establish, has two sides, proposition, opposition, and those two sides are established to debate matters. And they say that conversing and debating brings out the best out of a conversation, and that is definitely not what we see. We see horrible things happening in every parliament, and we know today, by the condition of the world, the past century that has been the foremost era of democracy has been an utter failure. Because today, the world is at the brink of collapse. Climate change, global warming, inflation, unbearable interest rates, housing crisis, food crisis, water crisis, wars in every country. Almost more than about 120 countries currently in the world either are meddled in a war, an inter-country war, or a civil war. There is no peace or harmony in any country. There are ethnic conflicts, racial conflicts, civil conflicts in almost all the countries in the world. The world is divided than ever. And that is a direct result of democracy. If you look at the United States, there is the Democrats, Biden and his brothers and sisters in arms, and then the Republicans. And America, which has like a short history of 100, 200 years, so it's not even a country where we can really explore. And America is more polarized than ever. If you get 5 or if you get 10 people to vote, 5 of them will vote Republican and 5 of them will vote Democrat. And you can't really get into a proper solution because it's divided. And obviously, think about it. A concept like democracy, which is based on the preliminary idea of dividing. Democracy is debate, right? How can you debate without dividing it? Without division, without a proposition and opposition. So you bring in a concept like democracy and you apply it to governing a country, there is not going to be unity. It's ultimately going to be division. That is what results in. This is why we see there are a lot of countries which are unified under singular leadership, and wise leadership for that matter, of course. That's the condition. Like many countries in the Middle East, are now hailed as much more developed countries and are on a path to even more developed and better economic status than most of the countries that have a democratical governance. So that is another form, I would say, because what we see, and I live currently, I'm based out of Canada, and we have a form of democracy here. And my home country has a form of democratic socialist republic governance. I don't know what that actually means. I don't even know if the politicians know what that means. But regardless, what we see is that a democratic country says that you have to separate religion. You follow your religion, sure, but that is something that should be hidden in your heart. Don't display it, don't bring it out. We don't want to mix up religion with other matters of governance or employment or whatever. We want to keep, like for instance, education should be secular. So secular education, that's what you subscribe to. Secular employment. So if you're working, don't mix up your religious identity and religious ideals and principles with it. Work is work. Just work. Regardless of whether that is selling alcohol or butchering or killing innocent people, doesn't matter. If it's an employment, then just do that. Don't bring it to your religion here. You want to practice your religion? Keep it in your home. And then what happens? Slowly, secularism is being forced into the home also. if people take that advice and say, okay, fine, I'll keep my religion private, I'll do whatever you want outside, I'll accept what you say, I'll go to a public school, I'll get secular education. But then what do? In the name of secular education, they start indoctrinating horrible, terrible, unacceptable ideas into the child's mind. This is what democracy breeds. So, I am personally someone completely against democracy purely because of the evidence, because of the irrefutable evidence that we have today that democracy is an utter failure. Now, among Muslims also, I have to say, unfortunately, there is plenty of examples of shirk by negation. Many Sufis, like a Sufi who was known as Ibn Arabi, he claimed that only Allah exists, meaning that you and me and the table and the chair and the trees and the moon and the sun and everything is Allah. Subhanallah. We know very well that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is at the highest place. He is on His arsh, on His throne. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a separate being, an entity. We don't know what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala looks like. But we know that there is nothing like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But what Ibn Arabi said is something extremely dangerous. Because it means that even if you look at something unclean like garbage or feces or urine, it's all Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Astaghfirullah. So all is Allah and Allah is all, or everything is Allah and Allah is everything. You and me are everything. You know, the danger with this concept is that when you start thinking that you are part of Allah, you are Allah and Allah is made up of you, some people take it a little bit far and say, hey, I am Allah, you are Allah, so worship me. So that concept comes in by saying that everything is Allah, so I am Allah, so why don't you worship me? Subhanallah, astaghfirullah. So that is an actually very dangerous concept. I remember when I was young, there was this movie that became very popular called Rabne Bana Di Jodi. This was an Indian movie, I think acted by an Indian superstar, Shah Rukh Khan. And the whole premise of that movie is, it's a romantic story. And the premise of that story is, Tujhme Rab Dikhta Hai. So Tujhme Rab Dikhta Hai means, I see God in you. And the whole story is about, how I see God in you and you see God in me, and therefore we love each other. It's an unusual type of love, I would say then. But this is what imagining or considering that we are part of God and God is part of us. So we are all God. God is us all put together. That is the danger with that concept. And all of these examples are examples for shirk by negating and denying the existence of God in a clear manner or a vague manner. And Islam clearly rejects all of these concepts. Islam is very clear. La ilaha illallah. There is no God but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only one, which is what we learned from Tawheed ar-Rububiyah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only one who is in control. He created everything. Everything came from Him. He is the beginning. He is the cause. And everything will end except Him. Once we end, for example, the human life, we all will face death. And once we face death, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to resurrect us. And He will judge us on Yawmul Qiyamah, on the day of judgment. And that day, every single person will have a one-to-one meeting with his Lord. and will have to show account for all his deeds, all his words, all his thoughts, all his intentions, all his wealth, all his health. Everything will have to be shown account for, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will decide what the rest of his fate is going to be. Is it going to be eternal bliss in Al-Jannah, or is it going to be eternal torment in Al-Jahannam? May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us understand His beautiful deen and help us understand that shirk, no matter what form it is rejected and is the biggest sin, and that it is unforgivable, and therefore may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide us to never ever commit shirk, not even for a moment of a second, and may He lead us to a point of a good death where we die upon the testimony La ilaha illallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.